Hello. We are going to wrap up talking about at least the early demands for equality in the civil rights movement, and we are still in the textbook Prentice Hall United States History, Modern America. It is available for free at the National Emergency Archives, and today we are going to talk about the Montgomery Bus Boycott. In addition to legal efforts during this era, some civil rights activists took direct action to end segregation. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, an African American seamstress, boarded a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and sat down in an empty seat. Several stops later, the bus driver requested that she give up her seat to a white passenger. Montgomery law required African American passengers to give up their seats to whites. After Rosa Parks refused to obey the law, she was arrested. The policeman asked if the driver had asked me to stand up, and I said yes, and they wanted to know why I didn't. Parks later recalled. I told them I didn't think I should have to stand up. After all, I'd paid my fare and occupied a seat. I didn't think I should have to give it up. Rosa Parks launches a movement. Parks' actions set in motion a chain of events that transformed the civil rights movement. Over the next few days, a corps of civil rights activists in Montgomery organized a one-day bus boycott. They called upon the black community to refuse to ride the buses as a way to show their opposition to Parks' arrest, in particular, and segregation in general. Meanwhile, during the Montgomery bus boycott, the NAACP began preparing a legal challenge. For a while, many people thought that Parks had refused to give up her seat simply because she was tired after a long day of work. But in reality, Parks had a record of fighting for civil rights. She had been active in the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP for years. This does not mean that she had set out to get arrested and spark a movement. But Parks and other activists welcomed the chance to use the incident to protest bus segregation. Martin Luther King urges nonviolence. On the evening following the boycott, the Montgomery Improvement Association, the organization that sponsored the bus boycott, had a meeting. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a Baptist minister, addressed the group. Though he had little time to prepare, King delivered an inspirational speech that brought the audience to its feet. Noting that African Americans were tired of segregation and oppression, King declared that there was no alternative but to protest. However, he called for the protest to be nonviolent. He urged them not to become resentful, which would lead to hatred towards whites, but rather to follow Christian doctrine and love them. After King spoke, the Montgomery Improvement Association vowed to continue the boycott and chose King as its leader. For more than a year, African Americans in Montgomery maintained their boycott of the buses. They did so despite economic pressures from their employers and threats of violence by the Ku Klux Klan. King himself survived a bombing of his house. Fortunately, his wife and baby daughter were not home at the time. Finally, in 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that the Montgomery City Law that segregated buses was unconstitutional. After more than a year, the MIA ended its boycott and African Americans began to ride the buses again. Ministers from the SCLC. The bus boycott represented a tremendous victory for African Americans in Montgomery and across the nation. The boycott revealed the power that African Americans could have if they joined together. The protest also elevated King and his philosophy of nonviolence into a prominent position within the civil rights movement. After the boycott, King and another Montgomery minister, Ralph Abernathy, established the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to continue the struggle for civil rights. Made up largely of Southern African American ministers, the SCLC advocated nonviolent resistance to fight injustice. The SCLC went on to organize a series of protests, including a prayer pilgrimage in Washington, D.C. in 1957, which helped convince Congress to pass civil rights legislation. Still, discrimination and segregation remained widespread. Checkpoint. What role did Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. play in the Montgomery bus boycott? Well, the bus boycott begins because Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat when told to do so, and Martin Luther King Jr. is kind of the organizer of the protest, and he is the one that insists that the protest be nonviolent. So that wraps up at least the beginning parts of our discussion on civil rights, and we will do more later on. Until then, you guys stay safe.